This is my cosplay of Denji featuring fully moving chainsaws. The main pieces are these two arm saws and the helmet, which by my count consists of 123 individual pieces. Outside of the moving saws, it also features remote-controlled LED eyes on the inside of the headpiece, as well as a jaw which moves with the wearer's own mouth. So how did this all come together? Well, let's just go all the way back to the beginning. The entire build took place over the course of 9 weeks, with 8 of them actually being spent working on this. I wasn't really sure how to format this video, so you know what? We're just gonna go through it week by week in a heavily condensed fashion. The first week consisted of drawing up design ideas and making early models of the costume. There was a big decision that I had to make first and foremost that I went back and forth with for the first couple weeks. That is, there were 2 ways I could get this to work. Belts or chains. For reference, this is what a belt looks like. It's, well, a belt that's driven by wheels. Chains, on the other hand, such as the ones used on an actual chainsaw, are driven by sprockets. In either case, both would be driven by these small right-angle motors. The plan was to have motors in the arm drive the chainsaw mechanism with a gear. While there is a slight loss in mechanical energy compared to attaching the drive directly on the motor, driving it with a gear would allow the arms to have a thinner profile. The head, on the other hand, was a different story. The driving mechanism there could be attached directly on the motor since you can just hide the motor inside the headpiece. Going back to the method of movement, there are pros and cons to belts and chains. Belts are much simpler, much lighter than chains, and easier to replace in the event that they fail. Chains are generally considered to be more reliable than belts, but if the application is just a cosplay costume for show, then the choice of a belt is the blatantly obvious one as it wins in every category of reason except one. Chains are way cooler. So obviously I went with chains. I set out to first create the arm saws, a decision which I would later come to regret. If any saw should have taken priority for getting it to function, it should have been the head, seeing as it's not only smaller, but also the centerpiece of the entire costume. I printed out some test sprockets and chains, but those didn't work because the printer wasn't calibrated properly and decided to fuse all my links together. Oh yeah, not to mention that I also kind of failed to notice that this mixing chamber here was half open, and I accidentally made nylon powder snow all over the lab. Anyways, that was that, and I already had a delay right off the bat. But week 1 was all about planning, and at this point I had developed a full plan. A plan which basically immediately went out the window. I really didn't do much during week 2. I used some reference images to design the headpiece, and then I 3D printed it. I ended up deciding that it was too big though, so to fix that, I went back and used one of these to get some measurements of my head. After that, I scaled a picture of my side profile in Fusion 360 to get a more appropriately sized helmet. In the end, I still kinda made it way bigger than it needed to be, but let's just say I was overcompensating since I've had a bad experience with 3D printing headpieces in the past. Okay, finally I could actually focus up and start seriously working on this build. During this week, the model was mostly finished, although extra details would be added here and there afterward. Most of these details were 3D printed with PLA, however, some were also EVA foam. After several attempts with the chain and sprocket mechanism, I accepted the fact that it would eventually just be too heavy for these motors, and I ended up using the belt and wheel system instead. I 3D printed the first parts for the base of the headpiece, along with early versions of the moving wheels and gears. I also started cutting my saws from EVA foam, but I suck at cutting, and I made new ones with a laser instead. I don't typically like using a laser for EVA foam. There's nothing wrong with laser cutting EVA foam in the same sense that certain materials like PVC are an absolute no. More so just minor things like the fact that EVA foam tends to get a little fiery in the laser cutter at times, so you have to watch it pretty carefully. And also, if you don't maintain the head while doing this, soot will eventually build up and eventually crack the lens on a very, very expensive machine. Did I learn this the hard way? Maybe. If nothing else, this project has given me a massive amount of respect to people who cut EVA foam by hand. Granted, experienced individuals probably have better blades that don't get dull every 3 minutes, but I feel like a goddamn caveman even trying. So I always just throw it in a big box and say laser go burr. To get the arm slots right, I put my arm up against a cutting board mat and scaled the measurements similar to what I previously did with my head. The parts for the head at this point had been mostly finished printing, and so I post-processed them, first using gradually finer grits of sandpaper, and then filler primer afterward. Base coats of paint were also applied for the pieces. And at the same time, I made the initial belts with the chainsaw blades attached. The blades were laser cut out of 5mm EVA foam and then hot glued directly on. Originally, the belts had a narrower layer to fit onto the track, but this was later discarded in the final version, as it was hard to keep it perfectly uniform throughout the entire length. As for the arm saws, the centerpieces were all cut out of scrap foam. Spacers were cut out of foam as well to keep the gears centered. The pulleys were then placed on the saw with 8mm aluminum shafts in their center that I had cut using an angle grinder. The movement was a partial success. See, I'm really not sure what I was thinking using foam for the entire saw. Kind of an idiotic move on my part. Because the foam is flexible, when the motor was turned on, the saw would bend inward, causing the belt to fly off the wheel. In light of this, I would later switch to making cardboard saws, which were far more rigid. Okay, so the first versions of the cardboard saws were laser cut, and I also began working on doing the teeth. I would later replace these though, as I wasn't really satisfied with them. I finished base coat painting most of the headpiece and cut some PEX pipe for the handlebars. I would also replace these two for better ones since I felt it made the whole thing look a little too big. So yeah, quite a bit of backtracking. Since I had a contest application deadline to meet, I pretty much hot glued and taped everything together, just for test fitting and pictures. Here's what it looked like. I should also mention that this is when I came to the disappointing realization that while designing this thing, I suppose I just straight up forgot basic physics, or just basic common sense for that matter, since the saw's length sticks out over 2 feet away from my face, and taking a look earlier to see that there's essentially no form fitting inside the head, it shouldn't be surprising that when this thing is placed on my head, it would just immediately want to roll forward until the saw was pointing straight down. I would absolutely need to fix this, as in this picture, there's basically just a cardboard panel pressing on my nose with an uncomfortable amount of force. What makes it even worse is the fact that I designed it as best I could with my head's measurements in mind, but not its actual shape, meaning that it was just big enough to snugly go over my head, but too small to easily insert modifications. If I could go back, I would have saved myself the filament and just use a motorcycle helmet as a base. So in case you haven't noticed, there was only 3 weeks left for this build, and all things considered at this point in time, I was quite a ways away from the finished product I had in mind. All I had to show for the previous 5 weeks was something that you would be hard-pressed to call wearable, and constantly on the brink of falling apart, being held together with duct tape and hot glue. No moving saws, no fully installed electronics, and lackluster paint. I'm not really experienced in cosplay, so to my surprise, this ended up being far more difficult and time-consuming than I had initially imagined. I had severely underestimated the difficulty of pulling this off at my current skill level, and furthermore, had been procrastinating far too much. But like all expert procrastinators, I switched gears into full overdrive at the last minute. I cut out the final versions of the saws, and even though I wasn't initially planning it, started adding decorative chainsaw links to the edges for higher detail, with each arm saw needing 215 individual links to be hot glued. I finished up that process of assembling the saws that I had mentioned earlier. Before painting them, I used this quick seal to hide the seams of the center as well as I could. I forgot to mention that the saws had to be separated as they were too big to be cut out in one piece with a laser. When assembly was completely finished on the saws, I painted them in metallic silver. During this week, I had also finally at last created a fully functioning saw that could move reliably without the belt coming off. I also remade the teeth since, as I mentioned before, I just didn't think the previous ones looked good enough. I think this is a good point to outline my process for creating the teeth. I started with these EVA foam dowels and cut them to varying lengths. I figured I'd probably need somewhere around 25 teeth. Then I inserted steel wires so that I could easily place the teeth into the mouth as well as give the base some rigidity. The teeth were then roughly sanded with the Dremel tool and sanded more smoothly with this orbital sander. They were then inserted onto the mouthpiece and held in place with hot glue. The hot glue also serves the aesthetic purpose of creating a gum effect. Finally, I painted the teeth in acrylic. With the head saw complete, something I had to worry about was actually attaching it to the head. First, I hot glued the saw between the two head panels, and then I used JB Weld epoxy to permanently fix it there. It works out really well since it's kind of adding to the look that the chainsaw is sort of organically grown out. Another thing I regret with this build is that I really wish I thought through a better way of holding everything together, as I ended up displaying quite an over-reliance on glues and epoxy. I created the final belts used for the arm saws, and I managed to get the first arm saw working as well. I decided I wanted to go over the head with a different shade of orange with acrylic paint, as well as start detail painting some of the pieces, starting with yellowing the teeth. And I also created some LED eyes to place inside the head using these remote-controlled puck lights. Luckily, the puck lights sit high enough so that they don't obscure my vision. I also added a lot of blood and grime to the head saw. Now, turning the arm saws on is fairly easy. There are switches on the inside that can be pushed forward. But what about the head saw? Well, for that, I decided to take inspiration straight from the anime and have it so that it activates by pulling a cord. I took a lamp switch and did some modifications, attaching it to a paracord necklace that I made, which has an adjustable knot. There's a barrel connector that can be plugged into the head after putting on the necklace. Then I attached a triangle ring that I laser cut via a paracord to the pull chain on the switch. I finished installing all the electronics, and then I went over the saws with the same process as the head, adding blood splatters and dirty spots everywhere to give it a more realistic feel. I also attached I was just kind of winging it, but here's how that went. Crowd seemed to really like it. Oh, but I lost to Genshin Impact. Okay, so I want to offer you guys a more in-depth look at the finished product. Here we have the headpiece. Excluding the electronics and some repurposed/modified parts, it is comprised of 123 individual self-made pieces by my count, 31 of which are 3D printed from PLA, 46 cardboard details, 36 EVA foam pieces, and 10 pieces of PVC pipe. Now, for easy access to replace the battery, this panel on the upper jaw is attached via Velcro. The puck-light eyes are glued onto the sides and do require some occasional reattachment. Again, they're remote controlled. And this is the motor for driving the head, powered by a 9-volt battery. This is where the barrel jack connector for the cord goes, so you just put on this necklace and pull on it to turn it on and off. I didn't show it in my build process, but the lower jaw is fixed to the head via small steel axles, and the elastic straps make it so that it goes back when you close your mouth. Wish I made it so that these handlebars were bolted down and would have made carrying this thing around a whole lot easier. Also on the inside, you have some form fitting for the head, a lot of foam, and to fix the issue of the whole thing rolling forward, I actually cut the front half of an adjustable head strap from an old hard hat that I found lying around. It's kinda just held there with a ludicrous amount of hot glue and epoxy, so I get anxious all the time while I'm wearing it about it breaking, but oh well. Here are the arm saws. Now to replace the batteries on these, the top panels are removable, also with Velcro. Can be a little difficult sometimes. Now here we can see the slide switches for turning them on and off. You flick your finger forward to turn it on, and pull it back to turn it off. And the whole thing just kinda sits on my arm. That's pretty much it. A whole lot of work went into basically 3 main pieces, as you just saw. Overall, I used quite a lot of scraps and leftovers from other stuff to make this, so the whole thing probably barely costed around $200 to make. Which is not bad at all for this, if you ask me. Functionally, it's pretty good, still get some occasional belt misalignment here and there, and I'm kinda overdriving the motors with 9 volts, so you have to avoid letting them stall. Aesthetically, again, I'm a bit of an amateur with paint, but I'm pretty happy with it. Other than that, I only wish I didn't make the head so needlessly big. Would have saved me a lot of discomfort.